Workers of the world, I ask you, have you ever wondered why the world you build with your own hands feels like a world you cannot control? Why the rules that govern your life seem written somewhere far above you by those you will never meet, for purposes you are never allowed to question? This is not an accident. It is not a flaw. It is the system's most deliberate design. For a ruling class to maintain its dominion, it must ensure not only your exhaustion but your confusion. It must cloud your vision, distort your understanding, and force you to accept as natural the very chains that bind you. Your confusion is their profit. Your disorientation is their shield. Because clarity, true clarity, is revolutionary. Capitalism survives not by its strength, but by your uncertainty. It fragments the world so that you see only isolated struggles, your job here, your wage there, the price of bread rising, the rent suffocating you, the debts multiplying like a plague. It wants you to believe these are personal failures, not structural weapons forged against you. It wants you blinded to the simple truth. The wealth of the few is extracted from the confusion of the many. But let us speak plainly, as Marx did when he tore away the illusions of his age. There are only two great camps in society, those who own and those who labor. The capitalist class accumulates power not through genius or virtue, but through the exploitation of the working masses. They control the factories, the land, the machines, the institution, and even the very language through which society understands itself. They will call their domination freedom, their exploitation opportunity, their hierarchy merit, and their extraction of surplus value the economy. They will cloak inequality in statistics, bury injustice in jargon, and present the suffering of the masses as a natural condition rather than a manufactured consequence. This is why clarity is dangerous. To see exploitation is to expose it. To understand your role in the system is to resist it. To recognize the unity of the working class is to threaten the power of the elite. And so the system keeps you fragmented, divided by race, divided by nationality, divided by religion, divided by manufacture, aspirations, divided by the illusion that you are competing with one another rather than being collectively exploited. The ruling class studies you more carefully than they study their own machinery, for they know machines do not rebel, but people do. Yet history teaches us a truth as old as struggle itself. Once the worker sees the reality of his own condition, he becomes the greatest force on earth. Marx did not write merely to analyze the world. He wrote to arm you with clarity so that you may transform it. For clarity reveals that the wealth produced by millions cannot rightfully belong to the hands of a few. It reveals that the worker, alienated from the product of his labor, becomes alienated from his own humanity. It reveals that exploitation is not a glitch in the system, it is the system. And it reveals that capitalism, no matter how it is polished, rebranded or modernized, will always rest upon the unpaid labor, the extinguished dreams, and the voiceless suffering of the working class. Workers, you do not lack power, you lack recognition of your power. You do not lack strength, you lack unity. You do not lack intelligence, you lack clarity deliberately stolen from you. The ruling class fears your awakening more than any crisis, any market collapse, any war, or any technological disruption. A conscious working class is the one phenomenon capitalism cannot survive. For when workers understand their collective power, they cease to be laborers and become historical agents, the makers of a new world. Therefore I say to you, do not let the system tell you who you are. Do not let the ruling class define your limits. Do not let confusion create obedience. Seek clarity, not the clarity handed down by the institutions of the powerful, but the clarity that emerges from your own lived experience, your own labor, your own suffering, your own collective strength. Because when the worker sees clearly, he stops bending. When he understands, he stops obeying. When he unites, he becomes unstoppable. The system fears your clarity because clarity births consciousness. Consciousness births solidarity, and solidarity births revolution. And revolution, true revolution, begins not in the streets but in the mind of every worker, who finally realizes the world you build is the world you have the right to own. The ruling class maintains power by keeping workers confused and divided, because confusion weakens resistance and division destroys the possibility of solidarity. When people fail to understand the forces that shape their lives, they become easier to manage, easier to manipulate, and easier to pacify. The ruling class has always always known that knowledge is dangerous when placed in the hands of those who produce the world, for an informed working class can see the hidden mechanisms of exploitation. So the system surrounds the worker with noise, distractions, competing narratives, and contradictory explanations until he no longer knows where the truth ends and the illusion begins. Instead of recognizing the structural nature of his struggle, he is led to believe that his suffering is the result of personal shortcomings, individual failures, or the misfortunes of fate. In this way, the worker internalizes the hardships imposed upon him as though they were unavoidable laws of nature rather than deliberate outcomes of an economic order designed for the enrichment of a minority. Confusion is not merely a lack of knowledge, but a weapon strategically wielded to cloud the worker's understanding of his position in society. It keeps him unsure of who his real adversaries, uncertain of where his anger should be directed, and hesitant to question the legitimacy of the system that oppresses him. When the worker feels overwhelmed by complexities, economic jargon, political rhetoric, endless reforms that promise change but deliver none, he becomes paralyzed. This paralysis benefits the ruling class, for a confused worker is a compliant worker, one who is too preoccupied with making sense of his own suffering to organize against those responsible for it. The system intentionally fragments information, ensuring that the worker sees only isolated problems rather than the interconnected structure of exploitation that binds them together. Yet confusion alone is not enough to maintain control. The ruling class must also keep the workers divided. A unified working class possesses immense power, far greater than the wealth or authority of the elite. To prevent this unity, the system cultivates divisions along every line it can manufacture. Workers are encouraged to see each other as competitors rather than comrades, enemies rather than allies, threats rather than partners in struggle. They are separated by race, nationality, language, religion, political affiliation, and even by the nature of their employment. The system turns diversity into a tool of fragmentation, obscuring the shared material interests that bind workers across all identities. By focusing on what makes them different, workers lose sight of what makes them the same, their exploitation, under a system that thrives on their labor, while denying them the full fruits of it. The ruling class reinforces these divisions through institutions designed to reproduce them. Schools teach obedience rather than critical inquiry. Media outlets amplify fear and conflict rather than unity. And workplaces structure competition so deeply into their culture that cooperation seems unnatural or even dangerous. Workers are taught to distrust each other, to guard their positions, to cling to the small advantages granted to them by the system, even if those advantages come at the expense of their class. When workers believe their enemy is the person beside them rather than the system above them, the ruling class wins, without ever needing to show its face. This is the brilliance and cruelty of their strategy. They rule by making the oppressed fight among themselves, exhausting their energy in battles that change nothing about the conditions of exploitation. Division also serves to weaken the worker's sense of identity. Instead of recognizing himself as part of a vast collective with shared interests, he begins to see himself as isolated, alone, and powerless. This isolation allows the ruling class to deepen its control, for a solitary worker is far more vulnerable than one who stands as part of a united class. The worker loses the ability to imagine collective power, collective struggle, or collective liberation. Without unity, even the most severe injustices appear insurmountable, and the ruling class appears invincible. The ruling class maintains power because it understands that the greatest threat to its dominance is not individual rebellion but collective awakening. It fears the moment when workers realize their true position in society. It fears the clarity that comes from understanding the mechanism of exploitation. It fears the solidarity that emerges when workers see each other as brothers and sisters in struggle rather than rivals. So it keeps them confused about the nature of their oppression and divided from those who share their fate. Confusion blinds them to the truth, and division prevents them from acting upon it. This is how the ruling class preserves its authority, not through strength or moral superiority, but through the systematic obscuring of reality and the careful cultivation of discord. ensuring that workers never fully grasp the immense power they hold when united and clear-eyed about their own condition. Clarity about exploitation is the first step toward revolutionary consciousness, because exploitation is the hidden engine of the capitalist system, and only by recognizing it can the worker begin to understand the true nature of his oppression. Exploitation is not simply unfair treatment or low wages. It is the systematic extraction of surplus value from the laborer, the process by which the capitalist appropriates the wealth that the worker alone creates. Yet this process is concealed beneath layers of ideology, routine, and social conditioning. The worker is made to believe that he is paid fairly, that the capitalist deserves his profit, and that the inequality between them is justified by talent, risk, or hard work. Only when the worker sees through these illusions does he awaken to the reality that his labor is the source of all wealth, and that the capitalist lives on what is taken from him without equivalent exchange. This recognition breaks the spell cast by capitalist ideology and opens the path to revolutionary consciousness. Clarity about exploitation requires stripping away the myths that surround the economic order. Capitalism thrives by presenting itself as natural, inevitable, and eternal. It disguises class relations as personal relationships, turning structural domination into seemingly voluntary contracts. The worker is told he sells his labor by choice, not because he must sell it to survive. He is told the wage he receives corresponds to his worth, not that it represents only a fraction of the value he produces. He is told that success is an individual achievement, not the product of collective labor and the historical accumulation of exploitation. When he begins to see that these narratives serve only to justify the power of the ruling class, he begins to understand his place in the system with new clarity. And once he understands, he can no longer accept the world as it is presented to him. Revolutionary consciousness emerges when the worker recognizes that exploitation is not an accident or a flaw, but the fundamental principle of capitalist production. Every profit has its origin in the unpaid labor of the working class. Every mansion, every corporation, every financial empire is constructed on the foundation of labor extracted without adequate compensation. This recognition transforms the worker's perception of society. What once appeared as a system of opportunity reveals itself as a system of theft. What once appeared as a relationship of mutual benefit becomes visible as a relationship of domination. What once appeared as a neutral market becomes transparent as a battlefield where the worker's life, time, and energy are continually sacrificed to enrich those who contribute nothing to production. Seeing this clearly is not merely an intellectual achievement, it marks the beginning of radical transformation. Clarity also disrupts the false consciousness that capitalism cultivates. Without understanding exploitation, the worker tends to blame himself for his hardships. He internalizes failure, shame, and inadequacy. He thinks he is not working hard enough, not skilled enough, not lucky enough. But when he realizes that even the hardest working laborer remains chained to low wages while the capitalist grows, richer with every hour of his toil, he sees that the problem does not lie within him but within the system itself. This shift in perception liberates him from self-blame and redirects his anger toward its rightful target. It turns despair into insight and transforms passive suffering into active awareness. In this way, clarity becomes a weapon against the psychological mechanisms that keep workers subdued. Revolutionary consciousness requires not only understanding exploitation but recognizing its universality among workers. Clarity dissolves the divisions capitalism imposes. When workers understand that exploitation is the common thread linking their struggle, they are more likely to unite across boundaries that once seemed insurmountable. They begin to see that their shared oppression is far more significant than their differences. This collective recognition is essential for revolutionary movement because no individual alone can overturn a system built on global structures of power. Only a class aware of its exploitation can form the solidarity necessary to challenge and ultimately dismantle capitalism. Thus, clarity becomes the bridge between isolated frustration and organized resistance. Finally, clarity about exploitation allows the worker to imagine alternatives. As long as he believes the current order is natural and unchangeable, no revolutionary consciousness can take root. But once he understands that the system is constructed, maintained, and justified through exploitation, he begins to see that it can also be dismantled, replaced, and transcended. He recognizes that the wealth he creates could sustain a society based on equality rather than hierarchy, cooperation rather than competition, human need rather than profit. This awakening plants the seed of revolutionary possibility. It allows the worker to envision a world in which he is no longer an instrument of production, but a human being with dignity, agency, and collective power. Clarity, therefore, is not merely awareness but the spark that ignites transformation, the moment in which the worker ceases to be an object of exploitation and becomes a subject of history, capable of shaping his own destiny and reclaiming the world he builds with his labor. Capitalism survives through the extraction of surplus value from the working class because the entire system is built upon the transformation of human labor into profit for those who do not labor. The worker enters the production process with nothing to sell except his labor power, the capacity to work, and he sells it because he must survive in a world where the means of life are owned by others. The capitalist purchases this labor power at a wage that reflects only what the worker needs to reproduce himself, not what he produces. Once the worker is in motion, once his hands touch the machine or his mind begins the task, he creates value greater than the wage he receives. This difference between the value he produces and the value he is paid is surplus value, the lifeblood of capitalism, the invisible thread running through every factory, every office, every industry that claims to be driven by innovation or entrepreneurship, but in truth survives only by appropriating the unpaid labor of millions. Surplus values, the secret of capitalist profit. It is the concealed mechanism that allows a minority to accumulate immense wealth without contributing equivalent labor. The capitalist class boasts of efficiency, risk-taking, and managerial genius, but all of this is merely decoration for the foundational reality that their wealth originates in the exploitation of workers who create more value than they are compensated for. Without surplus value, capitalism would collapse instantly because it has no other engine of growth. Machines produce nothing without humans to operate them. Capital is inert until labor animates it. Even the most advanced technology is worthless until a worker's effort turns potential value into actual value. The capitalist, however, claims ownership of what the worker creates because he owns the means of production, and this ownership grants him the legal and ideological power to appropriate the surplus. In this way, exploitation is embedded into the structure of society, hidden beneath the appearance of free exchange and fair wages. The extraction of surplus value takes many forms, but its essence never changes. The worker signs a contract that appears equal on the surface, yet it conceals a deeply unequal relationship. He is paid for his time, not for the value he creates. A worker may produce value equal to his daily wage in just a fraction of the workday. Everything produced beyond that point becomes surplus value, profit for the capitalist. This surplus is not an optional bonus, it is the central purpose of hiring the worker at all. If the worker produced no surplus, the capitalist would have no reason to employ him. Thus the exploitation of labor is not a peripheral injustice or a correctable flaw. It is the fundamental structure upon which capitalism stands. Every financial empire, every industrial fortune, every multinational corporation is built on this. Continuous extraction of unpaid human labor. Capitalism hides this reality through ideology. It teaches workers to see wages as fair compensation, as though the employer is doing them a service by providing a job. It glorifies the capitalist as a visionary who creates opportunities, when in truth the worker creates the wealth that sustains the capitalist's power. It presents inequality as a natural consequence of talent or industriousness, obscuring the reality that capital accumulates only because labor is exploited. The ruling class masks its dependence on workers by convincing those same workers that they should be grateful for the crumbs they receive. This ideological confusion ensures that surplus value extraction remains invisible, operate quietly behind the scenes, shaping the entire economic order while appearing to be nothing more than the normal functioning of the market. The extraction of surplus value also intensifies over time because capitalism demands endless expansion. The capitalist must continually seek greater profits, not out of personal greed alone, but because competition forces him to. If he fails to extract enough surplus value, he will be overtaken by others who do. This creates an unrelenting pressure to extend working hours, increase productivity, reduce wages, and exploit labor more intensely. As technology improves, not to liberate the worker but to increase the extraction of surplus value, the contradiction deepens. Machines reduce the need for human labor, yet profit still depends on labor's exploitation. This leads to cycles of unemployment, wage suppression, and overwork, all symptoms of a system that cannot survive without continuously consuming the life force of the working class. Capitalism survives only because workers remain unaware of the true nature of this exploitation or lack the power to resist it collectively. When workers understand that surplus value is the source of all profit, they see that the capitalist contributes nothing essential to the creation of wealth. They see that the owners live from the labor of others while claiming the status of innovators and leaders. They see that the structure of society is built on their unpaid hours, their depleted energy, their stolen time. This clarity reveals not only how capitalism functions, but why it must eventually be overturned. For a system that relies on the perpetual extraction of surplus value is a system that demands the perpetual subordination of the vast majority. And once workers recognize that they create everything yet own nothing, that they power the entire economy yet remain confined to the lowest rungs of society, the struggle for liberation becomes not only possible but inevitable. Worker unity is the greatest threat to the capitalist system because capitalism depends on the fragmentation, isolation, competition of those it exploits. The ruling class maintains its dominance not through superior numbers but through superior coordination, wealth concentration, and control of institutions that shape public consciousness. The workers, who are the overwhelming majority, possess the real productive power of society. They operate the factories, drive the transportation networks, maintain the infrastructure, provide the services, and generate all material wealth. Yet they remain disempowered because they are divided into isolated individuals or small groups, each struggling separately and each unaware of the immense collective strength that lies dormant within them. When workers unite, they transform from scattered laboring bodies into a conscious class capable of reshaping the entire structure of society. This unity undermines the very foundation upon which the capitalist system rests. Capitalism thrives by keeping workers in competition with one another. They are encouraged to fight for limited opportunities, to view each other as rivals, and to protect whatever modest advantages they may possess. The system cultivates a mindset that places individual success above collective progress, making solidarity appear unrealistic or even dangerous. Workers are fragmented by differences in skill, income, race, nationality, gender, contract type, and workplace hierarchy. These differences, however real they may seem, mask a deeper truth. They are all bound by the same economic relation to the capitalist. They must sell their labor to survive. Unity emerges when workers recognize this shared condition and see that their enemy is not the worker beside them, but the class that exploits them. When workers overcome these divisions and stand together, they erode the mechanisms the capitalist class relies upon to maintain control. The capitalist class understands this danger more clearly than the workers often do. It knows that a united working class could shut down production, distribution, and bring the entire economic machine to a standstill. Every factory, every office, every supply chain relies on the coordinated labor of countless workers whose withdrawal of labor would paralyze the system instantly. This is why capitalists invest so heavily in anti-union propaganda, union-busting laws, workplace surveillance, and narratives that frame collective action as disorderly or unpatriotic. They fear strikes not because strikes are chaotic, but because they reveal the workers' latent power. When workers act collectively, capitalists lose their ability to command, to dictate conditions, to arbitrarily assign value to wages, and to shape the daily lives of those they employ. Unity exposes the truth that the capitalist authority is neither natural nor inevitable, but dependent entirely on the workers' compliance. Worker unity not only challenges the functioning of capitalism at the economic level, but also disrupts its ideological foundation. Capitalism relies on convincing workers that they are powerless, replaceable, and dependent on the system for survival. But unity shatters this illusion. It allows workers to see themselves as part of a vast majority with shared interests and shared potential. It transforms them from isolated individuals into a collective force with a shared purpose. This shift in consciousness is revolutionary because it redefines the workers' relationship to power. Instead of internalizing the belief that they are subordinate, workers begin to recognize themselves as the true creator of social wealth, the essential backbone of all production, and the rightful agents of historical change. The moment workers understand this, the capitalist system begins to lose its legitimacy. Unity also amplifies the worker's ability to resist exploitation. A single worker demanding better conditions can be silenced, replaced, or ignored. 100 workers can be disciplined, but thousands, tens of thousands, or millions acting together become impossible to suppress. They can negotiate as equals, demand structural reforms, and challenge the authority of the capitalist class. They can expose the brutality of exploitation and force society to confront the reality that profit depends upon their suffering. Unity transforms struggles that seem minor or local into movements that address the systemic nature of capitalism itself. It opens the pathway from economic resistance to political transformation. Most important, worker unity carries within it the seeds of an alternative society. When workers cooperate, coordinate, and organize collectively, they demonstrate the very principles upon which a new social order could be built. They prove that society can function without the hierarchical domination of capitalists. They show that production can be guided by human need rather than profit, that decision-making can be democratic rather than dictated by ownership, and that communities can thrive through solidarity rather than competition. Every instance of worker unity, every strike, every cooperative effort, every collective victory reveals a glimpse of the world that lies beyond capitalism. Worker unity threatens capitalism because it calls into question not only the power of the ruling class, but the necessity of the system itself. It reveals that those who labor hold all the real power, that the capitalist is a parasite feeding off their effort, and that the chains binding workers are not natural laws, but artificial arrangements upheld by division. When workers unite, they awaken to their own strength, and this awakening marks the beginning of the end for any system built on their exploitation. True transformation begins when workers recognize their collective power, because the essence of their strength lies not in their individual struggles, but in their shared capacity to reshape the entire foundation of society. Under capitalism, workers are conditioned to believe they are powerless, isolated, and dependent on the very system that exploits them. They are taught to see themselves as mere individuals navigating a vast economic machine, each responsible for his own survival and success. This fragmentation ensures that their immense potential remains dormant, but the moment they begin to understand that their power is collective rather than individual, the illusion of capitalist dominance starts to crumble. Workers do not simply contribute to society, they sustain it. Every industry, every institution, every mechanism of daily life continues only because millions of workers cooperate, often without realizing that this cooperation is the key to their liberation. The recognition of collective power requires a shift in consciousness. Workers must see that what appears as personal misfortune is, in truth, a shared condition. Low wages, long hours, lack of security, rising costs of living, and diminishing freedom are not isolated experiences, but the common reality of an exploited class. When workers understand that their suffering is not random but systemic, they begin to see themselves not as individuals with personal problems, but as members of a class with shared interests. This understanding is revolutionary because it transforms despair into solidarity. It reframes the worker's identity from a lone struggler to part of a vast, interconnected, force capable of confronting the structures that dominate them. True transformation is not born from isolated anger, but from collective awareness that the power to change society lies in unified action. Recognizing collective power also exposes the fragility of capitalist authority. The ruling class appears strong only because the workers remain divided. The capitalist does not produce, does not operate machinery, does not transport goods, does not build infrastructure, does not provide essential services. All these functions are performed by workers acting together, whether consciously or not. The capitalist class survives because it manages to convince workers that their cooperation is natural, automatic, and inevitable. But when workers pause, reflect, and see that everything stops without them, they begin to grasp that the true power of society is in their hands. This realization is a threat to the ruling class, because it reveals that their authority is not inherent but dependent on the continued obedience of those they exploit. Collective power becomes transformative when it moves from understanding to action. Once workers recognize their shared interests and their ability to halt production, challenge authority, and demand change, they begin to act not as passive participants, but as active shapers of history. Strikes, protests, organized resistance, and collective bargaining become expressions of this awareness. But these actions are not the transformation itself, they are the beginning of a deeper process. True transformation occurs when workers understand that their collective power is not only a tool for resisting exploitation, but the foundation for building an entirely new social order. They realize that if they can shut down society, they can also run it. If they can cooperate to keep the system functioning under capitalism, they can cooperate to create a system based on equality, democracy, and shared ownership. As workers recognize their collective power, they also begin to see through the ideological structures that justify capitalist domination. They reject the myth that society must be governed by a wealthy minority. They reject the idea that profits are necessary for progress. They reject the belief that competition is the natural state of human life. Instead, they recognize that cooperation is the true engine of social development, and that solidarity is the foundation of human advancement. This shift in consciousness is what Marx described as the transition from a class in itself to a class for itself, a class that not only experiences exploitation but understands it, resists it, and organizes to overcome it ultimately. True transformation begins when workers see themselves not as scattered individuals, but as a united force capable of shaping their own destiny. It begins when they understand that the power of the capitalist class is nothing compared to the power of millions who refuse to be exploited. It begins when they no longer accept the world as it is, but imagine the world as it could be built by them, for them, and with them at the center of social life. Collective power is not simply a strategy. It is the birth of a new consciousness, the awakening of a class that has the potential to end exploitation and build a society rooted in justice, equality, and human dignity. In the end, the truth stands undeniable. The system thrives on your confusion, your division, your exhaustion, and your silence. Everything around you, every institution, every narrative, every workplace structure is engineered to keep you blind to your own power and obedient to the interests of those who profit from your labor. But the moment clarity breaks through the fog of ideology, the moment workers recognize not only the exploitation that shapes their lives, but the immense collective strength they hold, the foundation of capitalism trembles. For the ruling class is few, and the workers are many. The wealth of the world flows from your hands, yet the power to shape that world has been stolen from you. Understanding this is not simply enlightenment. It is the beginning of transformation. When workers unite, when they reject the lies that keep them isolated, when they embrace the knowledge that they create everything and therefore can change everything, the possibility of a new society emerges. A society built not on profit, but on human need, not on division, but on solidarity, not on exploitation, but on shared liberation. The future belongs to those who labor, and the moment they claim it together, the old world will fall, and a new one will rise.